Hello everybody, my name is Niels Engelen. I am a system engineer working for Veeam Software, and in this small video I will show you the integration from Veeam Endpoint Backup together with Veeam Backup and Replication. With this you can store your backups from any endpoint server directly onto your Veeam Backup and Replication repository. Very important to know is that this video is created based on the Veeam Endpoint Backup release candidate, so it may be that certain things change in the future or in the final release. Let's take a look at the settings which are required for Veeam Endpoint Backup to create a backup in your Veeam Backup repository. So first of all, as you can see here, I have already installed the product. I've made some successful backups. Last one was about an hour ago. And I will now go quickly over the settings which I have configured to create a backup directly into my Veeam Backup repository. So as you can see in my settings, I have chosen as a backup mode to backup my entire computer. Of course, it's also possible to just make a volume level backup or specific file level backup. But for this demonstration, I chose to make a backup of this entire computer. It's a small virtual machine of about 30 gigabytes, which I can then reuse to create a restore from scratch. Now with this release candidate, we see that the Veeam Backup and Replication repository is now a valid option where it was grayed out in the beta. So now it's perfectly possible to make a backup to a Veeam Backup and Replication server which has patch 2. I have to fill in my server name or my IP address. So as this is a test, I have just configured my IP address. Then, as you can see here, you can choose which backup repository you want to back up to. Now, each of the backup repositories which is visible in my Veeam Backup and Replication installation is visible here. So I have an NFS share and I have my default backup repository, which is the standard configuration from my temporary Veeam server. And as you can see, I have about 145 gigabytes available, and I've configured to keep at least 3 restore points from this specific computer onto my backup repository. On the schedule page, I've configured to make a backup every day around midnight. It's possible to modify these settings when you lock your computer, when you log off, when we realize that the backup target is connected. So there are a lot of options which you can freely choose, but for this test example, I've created the backup every night. And that's about it. There's not much to configure. I've now modified my backup job, and when I click or select run the job, when I click finish, I will recreate an incremental backup because I have already made some successful backups in the past to optimize this recording. Now let's continue with taking a small look at my Veeam Backup and Replication installation, how I have configured this. As currently this patch 2 is in a sort of release candidate state, it is not possible to install the patch 2 release candidate onto one of your production servers. There is a small requirement which says that your Veeam Backup and Replication server has to be installed less than 24 hours ago, just to make sure that there is no impact on any production server or somebody installs a release candidate on production environments. So for that case, I created a new Veeam Backup Replication installation. As you can see, my backup infrastructure is very simple. I have my default backup repository here, and I also added a Linux server which has the possibility to write to a specific share, has about 400 gigabytes of space. Now, to make sure that you can write to a Linux server within Endpoint, it is required to configure some endpoint permissions. There's a new button here called Endpoint Permissions, and then you can see that my repository access is put to allow everyone You can also modify it to specific users, or you can actually configure it that it's not possible to backup to specific repositories, so you don't have endpoint backups all over your infrastructure if you have multiple backup repositories. So as you can saw in the previous part in regards to my endpoint, I already created some backups, and now within the jobs there is a new thing called Endpoint Backup, where I have a backup of my laptop, which is my workstation, and here I have that virtual PC or that virtual installation which I created. I cannot say that I want to start it here. I can only delete it or disable it. Not much to say about that. But in terms of backups and the part where the disk backups are located, you can actually do a few other things. So if I select my virtual installation, there is a possibility to either, well, remove it from your backups or remove it from disk. View some properties. So as you can see here, I created the first backup, which was about 40 gigabyte, then the virtual machine backup size was about 10 gigabytes, and there was an incremental which was about 300 megabytes. Now, you can of course do guest file restores. So how does it work? So you select a specific restore point, you fill in a reason, for example test, and then next you can do is click finish. Now for those who have used Veeam Backup and Replication, you will notice that we actually reuse our famous instant file level recovery to perform specific restores of specific guest files for Windows. And as you can see here, I have my Windows 7 installation with my browser, and I can go through everything and perform a restore of a specific item. For example, I can browse through my user directory and I can perform a restore. Of course, I can copy it only locally. It's not directly possible at the moment. Now, another cool feature is that we can actually recover these disks into a virtual machine disk. So I select a specific restore point again. I can then say I want to export this disk on a specific server. So for example, I will restore it onto my Linux server because I have some more space there. And then as you can see, I have my endpoint disks to restore. So disk 0 is in this case my system disk. And there are multiple options available in restoring the format. So you can either restore it to a VMware virtual machine, so you can get a VMDK. It's also possible to say, well, I'm going to restore to a VHD file or a virtual hard disk extended, so the VHDX. So you can actually use it in a Hyper-V environment. You can fill in a restore reason, not needed, but always nice to have. And now we will actually convert our Veeam backup or our Veeam endpoint backup into a VMDK, which you can then mount to a specific virtual machine. Or if you have created a recovery appliance, you could actually use this VMDK and attach it to a freshly installed virtual machine which you have booted from that recovery appliance, albeit that there may be some drivers not 100% correct, but of course that's something that can be easily fixed. And once the restore is done, which took about 6 minutes here, and I would go to my directory where I made the export, as you can see here on the network share. I now have a VMDK file and have a flat file which is about 41 gigabytes, 40 gigabytes. And if I would use this within a vSphere configuration and I would add this to a virtual machine or a newly created virtual machine, because this was a backup from a virtual machine, it would power on without any problems. If I then switch to my vSphere web client, I could create a virtual machine from my new created VMDK. So if I say I want to create a new virtual machine, I give it a name, for example, endpoint test. I deploy it somewhere in my lab. Just put it on some standard storage. Of course, I am deploying a Windows 7 again. And I could then say, well, for example, in terms of my hard drive, here I have a standard hard drive. I am going to remove this. I will add a new hard disk or an existing hard disk, which is located on an NFS share, where I have my VMDK, which was newly created by Veeam. I give it some memory and some CPU resources, and I can click finish and the virtual machine will be created with my preferred settings. So as you can see now, I have my endpoint test, which has the newly VMDK created by Veeam. And when I select power on, this virtual machine will start up with my Windows 7 client, and after a few minutes I can then log into it by using either remote connection or VNC or something, and I can continue working on it as normal. When the boot has finished, I can log on to it and continue working as normal. And that's about it about the integration between Veeam Endpoint Backup with Veeam Backup and Replication. As you can see, it is really easy to configure Veeam Endpoint Backup to store your backups directly onto a Veeam Backup repository. Once they are created, you can always use Backup Copy Job to create a secondary copy of your endpoint backups, so that in case of something going wrong with the primary backup storage, you always have a copy, and it's really easy to achieve the 3-2-1 rule. If you want more information about Endpoint, make sure you check out the website go.veeam.com/endpoint, and the product will be available really soon. As stated again, this video is based on the release candidate, so there may be things that will change in the final version. Thank you for watching.